case you needed another sign that the rage from the right is rising to a dangerous boiling point, a new poll shows that nearly 40% of Republicans believe President Obama is doing many of the things that Hitler did. And now the half-term governor of Alaska is encouraging those angered by the Democrats and healthcare reform to reload. Sarah Palin taking time off from negotiating a multi-million-dollar reality show deal to tweet, "Common sense conservatives and lovers of America don't retreat, instead reload." Palin directing followers to her other social media outlet, Facebook. "With the president signing this unwanted and transformative government takeover of our healthcare system today with promises impossible to keep, let's not get discouraged." Instead, Palin supplies her flock with a hit list of 20 Democrats to target in the midterm elections, all House members who voted in favor of Obamacare and represent districts that Senator John McCain and I carried during the 2008 election. We're going to fire them and send them back to the private sector, which has been shrinking thanks to their destructive government-growing practices. Palin then provides supporters with a map of the districts currently held by the targeted Dems, indicating location through gun crosshairs. With 3 of the 20 Dems retiring, Palin wants to focus attention on holding the others accountable for their disastrous vote. Warning, "We'll aim for these races and many others." Meanwhile, some disturbing numbers unearthed by the latest Harris poll, showing the majority of Republicans believe that President Obama is a socialist and a Muslim. 45% of the GOP believe the birther line, saying Mr. Obama was not born in the U.S. 38% of Republicans believe the president is doing many of the things that Hitler did. And perhaps the most demented group a major polling firm has ever exposed, 24% of Republicans say that Obama may be the Antichrist. Joining me now is Associate Professor of Politics and African American Studies at Princeton University, columnist for The Nation magazine, and MSNBC contributor, Melissa Harris-Lacewell. Good evening, Professor. Polling results rather troubling. You have written in The Nation recently about a vicious new Jim Crow terrorism. In those polling results, do you have what you need to almost prove it?
Well, not quite. You know, one of the things I'd like to know is who else they might think the Antichrist is. You know, so in other words,
you have some follow-up questions for that poll.
That's right. Yeah. So I'd like to know a little more. But what I will say is one of the sort of biggest steps that America took over the past 50 years was an enormous sea change in American public opinion, particularly on questions of race, gender roles, a kind of opening of the American system, where in the 1940s and 50s you had people willing to say all sorts of racially discriminatory things, gender discriminatory things. And by the time you got to, for example, 2008, even to the extent that people harbored those feelings, they were really unlikely to report them in a poll. So the reason I find these poll results so sort of anxiety-producing is that it's an indication that the kind of socially acceptable lid that we've kept on these kinds of beliefs may be sort of bubbling off the pot with some boiling anxiety underneath.
There was a lot of overboiling this weekend in Washington. We saw the spectacle of Congressman John Lewis, a former civil rights marcher, being spat on, yelled at. Exactly the kind of thing that happened to him back when he was marching for civil rights. Much worse happened to him then. Very severe physical violence happened to him. What were your feelings watching that?
Yeah, so, I mean, that one was very hard, I think, for Americans who know that history to watch, to actually see this same person, this same body being attacked on questions of race. But for me, there was also this interesting shift, because remember that when he was marching as a young demonstrator, he was marching against the state, against the government, saying that he had the right, as did other African Americans, to be full citizens.
And was being beaten by agents of the government in those states.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, in this context, it's the racists who are the outsiders, and he is an agent of the state now, right? So on the one hand, you see this enormous change, this enormous transition, but I also think it calls us to say that this is not just a matter of bigotry or prejudice, but this is about people who are challenging the right of people like President Obama, Representative Lewis to actually be making policy. I mean, they are duly elected leaders in our country, and we have folks saying they don't have the right to levy taxes.
And was it your sensation that part of this notion that they don't have the right to do this has to do with their race and holding those positions?
You know, I have to say, it looked so much to me like...
I mean, when you hear the epithets...
Yeah.
It raises that question.
It does, and because it looks like the turn-of-the-century film Birth of a Nation, 1915, which looked back on the period of Reconstruction, when the anxiety was different kinds of people holding public office, this idea that somehow the country had been lost, and the fact that all of that was backed up with this kind of states' rights language, the same sort of secessionist language that we heard going on, that we see in this lawsuit, pushing back and saying the federal government doesn't have the right to tell us what to do. That's actually what the Civil War was about. It was about establishing that the federal government does have the right to make policy for the nation.
Now, turning to Sarah Palin, I'm not one who believes she's trying to incite violence. I mean, I'd have to give her a very big benefit of the doubt that this is what it sounds like when you're a hunter from Alaska. But there are enough people around her to say, you know what? When you say target a politician in a country that has suffered assassinations of our politicians and recent ones, you don't use the crosshairs. You have to use other symbols. Is she just out of it, or is this also an indication that this movement actually likes to move into that provocative direction?
Well, I mean, I appreciate that she said she was going to fire them and send them back to the private sector. That's a little different than the language about
fire them is okay.
Fire them, that's right. That is what democracy is. You are meant to, if you don't like the representatives, go out and run for office or vote for someone else. But I do know that there should be a kind of carefulness about people in public life. But I think that this is part of what Sarah Palin made a decision to do when she quit the role of an elected leader, one who would have the responsibilities of being careful. She went rogue and made a decision that, you know, she's going to organize on Facebook and Twitter, and I love Twitter, so not to demean it. I'm a big fan of Twitter.
How many followers do you have?
I think I'm up to 12,000 now. Come on, join the party. And yet, this notion that she has so little responsibility that she would use crosshairs to talk about an appropriate action, a Democratic with a little D action. People who disagree should absolutely vote against representatives that they don't like.
Melissa Harris Lacewell of Princeton University and a contributor to MSNBC, thank you for your unique insights into this subject.